This is the third part of a crash course about climate entitled Climate Change, Serious but Not Hopeless. This part is called Bending the Curve, and it's about how we can bend the curve of climate change, which is shown in this slide. This slide shows temperature measurements from 1880 to 2019 and the forecasted temperature rise if we do nothing to act to hinder climate change. Very soon we will pass the 1.5 degree warming threshold. Alternatively, we can choose a different future where we bend this curve so that it looks like this. So how do we do it? How do we bend the curve of climate change? The first step I recommend is to listen to young people. What have they told us? They have told us, you are never too small to make a difference. Well, we all feel small faced with a challenge such as climate change, but we should take it on board that we are not too small and our actions do matter. And hopefully, as I proceed through this lecture, I will be able to explain why. Another thing the young people have told us, and we as adults should certainly take this on board, is that you are never too old to learn. The gentleman in the image is Professor Bert Bolin. Professor Bert Bolin wrote a paper together with a colleague in 1959 where he did a forecast. And that forecast was of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere and how it would increase because of the burning of fossil fuels. This is his forecast, remember, published in 1959. These are measurement data. Professor Bert Bolin forecast the effects of burning fossil fuels over 70 years ago. Professor Bert Bolin was also one of those people instrumental in the founding of the IPCC, which gave climate researchers a voice to society. Professor Bert Bolin also gave the title and the meaning to this crash course. Climate change is serious but not hopeless. Those were Bert Bolin's words, published in January 2008, shortly after his death, in the Swedish daily newspaper. One other thing the young people tell us, and that is to listen to the science. And this is what the science looks like. These are the IPCC reports. They're enormous and they're difficult to wade through, but they're very, very important. And in them, there are suggested pathways which we can use to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. Now I'm going to talk about these pathways, and I'm also going to talk about the shortcomings of misunderstanding these pathways. Let's first take a look at a typical pathway, and it shows what needs to happen to our CO2 emissions. They need to drop drastically. It also shows us where those drops need to occur. One part is land use change. The way we use the land can either be a source or sink of carbon dioxide, as I will discuss shortly. The bulk is fossil fuels and industry, which the burning of fossil fuels must go down enormously. Built into these pathways is some level of so-called negative emissions. These are technical solutions whereby CO2 is artificially removed from the atmosphere. Within these pathways, and to use these pathways, one needs to read the small print to implement them properly. If one reads the IPCC report carefully, you will discover that tipping points are not included in the pathways. That's simply because we don't know enough about them. An example of a tipping point is the melting of the polar ice, the ice on the Arctic Ocean. As the temperature gets warmer, the ice melts. The Earth becomes darker because seawater is darker than ice. That means the albedo is reduced, which means Earth absorbs more heat, which means it becomes even warmer. That's what a tipping point is. Those are not included in the pathways. You also need to consider climate justice because those pathways are global averages. This image shows how different countries emit CO2 to the atmosphere. you'll notice that many of the poorer countries in the world emit very, very little. Is it really fair that the poorer countries should take the equal load of the emissions reduction? Or is it maybe the responsibility of richer countries to take on a bigger load? There's a heavy emphasis on negative emission technologies in these pathways. The problem is the negative emissions technologies are not there yet. I'll give you this example. This is a CO2 hoover. It captures CO2 from the atmosphere. It's brilliant. The CO2 is then pumped into bedrock and it forms those white crystals you can see along the crack in the rock. Thus the CO2 is stored for millions of years as a rock-forming mineral. That's great, but the capacity of this machine is 50 tons of CO2 per year. That's equivalent to the amount of CO2 released by 5 Swedish citizens. And the cost for every ton, 600 euros, to convert that CO2 into stone. So negative emission technologies are not there yet. We cannot rely on them until they are. Finally, the pathways give you a 66% chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. I ask you to think of the analogy that you get in an airplane and the pilot says, there's a 66% chance that we'll make it. There's a 34% chance that the plane will crash. Would you stay on the plane? So taking these considerations on board and thinking about these pathways, this is why climate scientists would advise a simpler message, focusing around climate safety. That message is quite simply, reduce emissions now. So how do we do it? Well, 4 simple steps. Sustainable land use. We make sure our land is a sink, not a source of CO2. Marshlands are good. They absorb CO2. Forests are good. And it's quite possible to farm the land in a responsible way, which stops releasing CO2 to the atmosphere. Renewable energy and sustainable industry, gone are the days when it's acceptable to burn rocks for energy. It's time to switch to renewables. We're excellent at wind power and solar power. We need to employ these technologies now, today. In the scientific community, we need to work on negative emission technologies. We need to get good at this. We need to have low-cost, effective negative emission technologies. And where we all can be part of the solution is reduce consumption. We can adopt the philosophy, reduce, reuse, recycle, in that order. I'm going to end this crash course with a few of my own reflections about actions to limit climate change. My first consideration is how individual action becomes collective. And I want to illustrate this with an example. Let's remember the problem. Annually, we release 43.1 billion tons of CO2. So what's my solution? I wait with buying a new mobile phone. Does that really help? Well, production of electronic items on average releases about 100 kilograms. That's 0.1 ton of CO2. So 0.1 ton of CO2 is not emitted this year because one less phone is produced because I don't buy it. But I'm not alone, and this is where it becomes collective. You see, there are more than 1 billion people in high-income countries and we can act together. And when we do so, that 100 kilograms becomes 0.1 billion tons of CO2 not emitted this year. The number starts to go down. We can take the train instead of the plane in Europe. The number goes down. We can use public transport instead of the car. Just for a month, the number goes down. We can do more months. The number will go down further. We can eat vegetarian 1 more day each week. The number goes down. Halving the amount of food we throw away. The number goes down. Recycle everything. the number goes down. Lower the temperature at home by just 1 degree. We've now eaten up more than 1 billion tons of CO2 by simple actions of reducing, reusing, and recycling. Another reflection, where individual action leads to behavioral change. In Sweden, there's been a lot of discussion about flying contra going by rail. The reason is simple. Take the example of a Stockholm to London return flight that releases 516 kilograms of CO2. Train, 110 kilograms of CO2, according to EcoPassenger. People have been listening and acting, and the Swedish Transport Agency has reported a reduction in air travel by Swedish residents of 4.5% in 2019 compared with previous years. That all adds up. That's 450,000 tons of CO2 not emitted to the atmosphere because of a behavioral change spurred on by individual action. Another reflection. From individual action, when that leads to business transformation. I live in downtown Stockholm. I get my heat remotely from a power station called Värtaverket. That heat is partly produced by the burning of coal. As a customer, I'm not satisfied, and I'm sure as an employee and a manager of the organization, one is not satisfied, which has led to the promise to phase out coal by 2022. What does that mean in terms of CO2 emissions? Instead of burning coal, burning biofuels. It's a 500,000 ton reduction in CO2 emissions. A final reflection before we end this course. When individual action leads to policy change. I highlight the youth movements because they're influencers. They've affected many members of society, including politicians. This is the Swedish government. They have listened to youth movements and the voices of the scientists and are starting to get to work. And one step forward is the establishment of a roadmap for the climate, for the future in Sweden. There may indeed be shortfalls in this roadmap, but it's far better that we have one than we don't. These are steps forward, and my own reflection, they are spurred on to some extent by individual action, which means that we all have a part to play in the climate change solution. Together, we can bend the curve of climate change. Thank you.